Welcome back to your favorite space for reflection, the subconscious classroom, your quiet sanctuary after sundown. We're so grateful to have your presence with us again this evening. Tonight's journey takes us not through pyramids or palaces, but through something far more intimate, the air itself. You are no longer here in the now. You are drifting backward through time into the heavy, fragrant fog of the 19th century. A world where the streets smelled like metal, the kitchens like burnt sugar, and the very idea of cleanliness could kill you softly. Tonight, we follow the invisible thread of scent through arsenic-laced soaps, smoky factories, and perfume bottles filled with poison and promise. A story not told through dates and battles, but through powder, paste, and the quiet exhale of history. Before we inhale the first traces of this forgotten world, feel free to let us know what corner of time you'd love to explore next. And if you enjoy this strange and scented voyage, consider giving us a like and subscribing, so we may keep tracing history's most unusual footprints together. Now breathe gently. The air is different here, and the story is waiting. Let us begin. Part 1, The Century That Reeked of Progress. Welcome back to your favorite space for strange truths, curious histories, and deeply forgotten corners of the past. Tonight, let's take a deep breath, but maybe not too deep, because the air we're about to step into doesn't smell like anything you've ever experienced. It smells like burnt sugar and rusted nails, like coal tar and lavender soap laced with poison. It smells like the 1800s, a century of steam and sweat, perfume and formaldehyde, arsenic and cake. This isn't just a story about what people did in the 19th century. It's about what they breathed, what they rubbed on their faces, what they sprinkled across their floors and dabbed behind their ears. It's about how an entire era smelled like a chemical experiment inside a pastry kitchen, and how nobody thought that was strange. To understand the smells of the 1800s, we need to understand the great machine grinding behind them, industrialization. The 19th century wasn't merely a time of railroads and telegrams. It was a time when chemistry suddenly became domestic. What had once been the domain of alchemists and surgeons now entered the world of housewives, tailors, and school teachers. The factory wasn't just across town. It was under your sink, in your lotion, on your plate. In 1800, much of Europe and North America still smelled like livestock, human waste, smoke, and raw earth. But by 1850, the air itself had transformed. Cities smelled mechanical. Homes smelled artificial. Bodies, or at least those who could afford it, smelled synthetically sweet, metallic, sharp, and powdery. Progress had an odor, and it didn't always agree with the lungs. Let's start in the place where most people began and ended their day, the home. A Victorian home wasn't sterile, but it wasn't exactly earthy either. Households of means were obsessed with appearances, and that included the air. Scented waters were sprinkled on linens, potpourri tucked into drawers, and strong floral perfumes were dabbed under the nose to mask less delightful realities. But behind those soft floral notes were some rather grim ingredients. Take arsenic. It sounds like something you'd use to kill someone, and it was, but it was also found in soaps, face powders, wallpaper dyes, and deodorants. A clean, perfumed home in 1870 might smell faintly like violets and slowly poison you to death. This was not considered a contradiction. In the world of medicine, the smells were even stranger. Hospitals in the 1800s didn't smell sterile. They smelled sharp and sour, a mix of old blood, metal tools, and early disinfectants. Carbolic acid, also known as phenol, became the miracle chemical of the mid-1800s. First introduced by Surgeon Joseph Lister, It was used to clean wounds, wash surgical tools, and coat bandages. It had a bitter, burning smell that clung to everything: metal, flesh, and memory. Doctors of the time must have walked around like walking chemistry labs, smelling like scorched metal and camphor. Speaking of scorched, factories were the engine rooms of the New World, and they smelled like it. Cotton mills, steelworks, and dye houses produced more than just goods. They belched out clouds of steam, oil, and chemicals. One of the most pungent offenders? Coal tar. Coal tar was the thick, sticky byproduct of gas production. It was black, oily, and it reeked. A dark, bitter blend of scorched earth, ash, and road tar. And yet, from this gunk came miracles. Synthetic dyes, early antiseptics, even flavorings. That's right, coal tar derivatives were used in everything from cough syrups to food coloring. There was no clear line between what went in your mouth and what was used to clean a factory floor. Now, let's step into the kitchen, because this too was a place of strange olfactory contradiction. You'd think that food, at least, would smell wholesome and familiar. And it did, in a way. Bread baking, stew simmering, candies hardening on wax paper. But alongside those warm notes came the bitter scent of burnt sugar, not the kind that caramelizes into creme brulee, but the kind used in the embalming rooms of early morticians. Yes, burnt sugar was often used in mummification-style preservation techniques for the deceased. A sticky, sweet smell that clung to the nostrils, reminding you that sugar was as much about decay as it was about dessert. In a world without refrigeration, sugar wasn't a treat. It was a tool. Cakes were made not just for birthdays, but to preserve meat, fruit, and even the odd souvenir from a funeral. You begin to see the contradiction. The 1800s were obsessed with cleanliness, yet surrounded by filth. They celebrated sweetness, but lived in a time of rot. They sprayed perfumes onto wounds, painted arsenic on their walls, and believed that health could be bottled and sold with a fancy label and a floral scent. And no one questioned why their living rooms smelled like cake and copper. Public life wasn't much better. The streets reeked: horse dung, coal smoke, sewage, and rotting produce from overcrowded markets. In London, the smell became national news. The Great Stink of 1858 was so overpowering, caused by the Thames doubling as a sewer, that Parliament nearly shut down. Sheets soaked in vinegar were hung over windows in an effort to keep the smell out. Politicians gagged over their ink blotters. Eventually, this horror led to the creation of London's modern sewer system, which was seen as a kind of engineering miracle, both for sanitation and the nose. Even the world of fashion came with its own smells. Leather gloves tanned in urine, corsets soaked in whale oil, shoes dyed with substances that made them glow and smell like glue, tar, or ammonia. A well-dressed Victorian might look elegant but smell like a chemistry set crossed with a barnyard. But the most astonishing part? People didn't seem to mind. The strange, conflicting scents of metal, cake, and chemical bloom weren't seen as warning signs. They were modernity itself. The smell of arsenic? That was the smell of a woman who took care of her skin. The tang of carbolic acid? That was the scent of progress in surgery. The burnt sugar cloud in a mortuary? That was a family doing their duty. It wasn't just ignorance. It was confidence. A belief that science, perfume, and a stiff upper lip could conquer even the worst odors. That if something smelled strange, it meant it was working. It meant you were clean, protected, enlightened. This was a world before warning labels, before we understood that the sweet almond smell of cyanide was not something to bottle, or that a perfume made from whale intestines and formaldehyde might not be suitable for children. But hindsight is a luxury. And in the 1800s, modernity had a smell sharp, saccharine, and slightly sickening. And yet, not all of it was bad. Some scents truly were comforting: beeswax, rosewater, lemon oil rubbed into wood floors. The mingling scents of a public bathhouse, equal parts steamy and soapy, filled with laughter and lavender. The rich, dark smell of books bound in real leather and stitched by hand. These were real too. They lingered between the harsher tones. Moments of peace, sent memories still hanging in the corners of old libraries and grandparent attics. The air of the 19th century was crowded, not just with smoke and fog, but with ambition, illusion, and an overwhelming belief that the future was being built in real time, and you could smell it in the wallpaper. Whether or not that wallpaper slowly poisoned you, of course, was a detail best left to tomorrow. Because today smelled like cake, and cake meant progress. Part 2. Soap that could kill you softly. The 1800s adored cleanliness, or at least the idea of it. A well-scrubbed floor, a delicately perfumed neck, a powder-dusted face. These were signs not just of hygiene, but of social standing. To smell good was to be civil. To smell strange but sophisticated was to be modern. And so, into wash basins and onto skin, people lathered, patted, and powdered themselves with products that often did more harm than good, all in the name of elegance. Let's begin with the soap. In the 19th century, soap wasn't just soap. It was medicine, perfume, skincare, and even politics, all lathered into one bar. Companies sprang up across Europe and America promising miracles. Remove blemishes, lighten your complexion, erase the sins of city life. A bar of soap could do it all, apparently. But many of these miracle bars were loaded with arsenic. That's not exaggeration. Arsenic-based soaps were sold openly to improve skin clarity and restore youth. They were especially popular among the upper and middle classes, where pale, smooth skin was not just beautiful, it was moral. Tan skin meant outdoor labor, and labor meant poverty. So if a few skin flakes and internal organs had to be sacrificed for a luminous glow, so be it. Some of these arsenic soaps came with warning labels, but many didn't. And even when they did, they often framed the danger as a feature: powerful, effective, purifying. Just don't lick your hands, or breathe too hard, or leave it where the children could find it. This wasn't some back alley scam. Respected chemists sold these products. Glossy ads ran in women's magazines, and society embraced them, even when users began reporting headaches, vomiting, and worse. But remember, in a world where bad smells equaled disease, a soap that smelled like almonds, a scent closely associated with arsenic, was a signal of strength. If it burned, it was working. Of course, not all 19th century soaps were lethal. Many were simply odd. Made from whale fat, beef tallow, wood ash, and lye, traditional soaps were harsh and utilitarian. They smelled like the barnyard and the bonfire had a baby. To cover the stench, perfumers turned to florals, spices, and exotic oils. The result was often overwhelming. A soap that reeked of lavender, lemon, or cloves, with a thick undertone of something industrial, like soot wearing a flower crown. And soap wasn't just for hands or bodies. Laundry soap was its own beast entirely. Victorian laundresses worked in steaming basements and wash houses, scrubbing linens with lye-heavy mixtures so caustic they peeled skin and left eyes watering. The air in these rooms was thick with steam, bleach, and the sharp, nose-pinching bite of ammonia. Laundry day was not a fragrant breeze. It was a battle. Even the air fresheners of the time came with baggage. Many households used vinegar-soaked cloths to cleanse the air. Others simmered herbs, spices, or citrus peels on the stove. But those who could afford it turned to manufactured solutions like camphor blocks, pine oils, and eventually early aerosol sprays. One popular item: fumigating pastilles. These were little scented pellets you'd burn in your parlor to cleanse the air. Some were made with rose or lavender oil. Others contained sulfur and nitrate. They didn't just freshen, they smoked. Light one up and your drawing room might smell like a honeymoon or a battlefield. Still, the logic made sense in their world. If you could smell something strong, then maybe it was killing the invisible threats. Germ theory was in its infancy. People still believed that miasmas, foul air, caused disease. So the goal was not to avoid chemical smells, but to unleash stronger ones to beat back the bad. This mindset crept into every corner of daily life. Hospitals burned antiseptic incense. Schools sprinkled disinfecting powders in cloakrooms. Train cars were scrubbed with carbolic acid. Even theaters got the treatment. Before a performance, ushers might walk through the seats with spray canisters, dousing the crowd in the sharp tang of pine oil and rubbing alcohol. Meanwhile, advertisements offered a dizzying blend of warnings and promises. One ad for a complexion-enhancing soap promised to remove blemishes caused by coal smoke, strong tea, and, oddly, reading too many novels. Another featured a glowing woman holding a baby and a bar of soap, promising health through fragrance. But the line between beauty and danger was razor-thin. Perfumes and colognes, too, were caught in this strange dance. The 1800s saw a boom in scent production, thanks to advances in distillation and synthetic chemistry. Fragrances that had once been rare and expensive, like vanilla or jasmine, could now be manufactured in labs. The result? An explosion of accessible perfume and a total breakdown of restraint. People sprayed perfume everywhere, into hats, on handkerchiefs, on letters, furniture, even pets. Some scents were delicate, like violet water or rose oil. Others were powerfully strange. Musk extracted from deer glands, ambergris from whale intestines, or synthetic blends that mimicked cinnamon, leather, or tar. Wearing perfume was part hygiene, part identity. A signature scent was considered a sign of refinement. And yet, many of the fragrances sold were loaded with unregulated compounds, from formaldehyde to benzene, giving them a sickly sweet sharpness that clung to fabric and lungs alike. In fact, some doctors began warning that excessive perfume could cause hysteria, or fainting, or nervous disruptions of the feminine mind. Not because the ingredients were toxic, but because the scents were too emotional, too distracting, too stimulating for a delicate constitution. Still, the trend marched on. By the end of the century, scent had become a sort of class marker. The poor smelled like coal and cabbage. The middle classes smelled like soap and powder. The wealthy smelled like flowers, plus a hint of something burning. That burning smell often came from the hair salon. Hair treatments in the 1800s were a cocktail of ambition and danger. Women used curling irons heated in fireplaces, applied lard-based pomades, and dusted their scalps with violet-scented powders that masked the smell of singed hair. Dandruff tonics often included mercury. Hair restorers promised miracles with ingredients like lead acetate. Your locks might glisten, but your scalp was sizzling. In fact, Victorian vanity was a kind of chemical warfare against the self. Skin creams included belladonna to dilate pupils. Eye drops sometimes contained silver nitrate. Teeth whiteners used sulfuric acid. If it sparkled or tingled, It was considered refined. And yet, despite all this, despite the arsenic, mercury, and camphor fog, there was an undeniable pride in the air. To smell like something artificial, something new, was a badge of modernity. The raw, barnyard smells of the pre-industrial world were fading. In their place, powdery perfume, chemical cleanliness, and the metallic bite of a civilization reinventing itself molecule by molecule. It was progress. It was sophistication. It was occasionally fatal. But it was also deeply human. A need to rise above the muck and mire. A belief that with the right powder, the right soap, the right smell, you could outpace time, disease, and even death, all while leaving behind a faint trace of lavender on your pillowcase. The 1800s were not subtle, but they were sincere, and in their scented chaos, they gave us a glimpse into what it meant to be clean, beautiful, and modern, even if it killed you softly. Part 3. How streets began to smell like science. Step outside in the 1800s, and the first thing you noticed was the air. It did not greet you gently. It scraped across your face, wrapped around your ankles, clung to your collar. Depending on the decade and the city, it might have smelled like coal smoke and horse manure, or urine and cabbage, or a strange, sweet metallic haze that made you wonder if the rain would burn your tongue. But if you lived in a growing industrial city, something new had begun to creep into the breeze. A smell that hadn't been there 50 years before. The smell of science. Cities in the 19th century were transforming. London, Paris, New York, Manchester, Chicago, once sleepy towns with gas lamps and muddy paths, were becoming mechanical, booming, electric-hearted machines. And with their steel railroads and smokestacks came smells the world had never known. Let's begin with gaslight. Gas lighting became widespread in the early 1800s, changing not just how cities looked at night, but how they smelled 24 hours a day. These weren't the clean-burning lights we use today. These were powered by coal gas, a flammable mixture created by heating coal in enormous retorts until it broke down into a mix of hydrogen, methane, carbon monoxide, and trace elements of what could only be described as nose-wrinkling menace. Coal gas stank. It reeked of burnt eggs, hot metal, and the inside of a chimney. The gas companies tried to mask this by scenting it with additives that made leaks detectable, but that just added a layer of medicinal funk to the whole operation. Pipes leaked, valves hissed, entire streets took on the sickly tang of scorched oil and chemistry. At night, you could walk under flickering lamps and feel the shadows flicker not just on your skin, but in your throat. Now add horses. Cities in the 1800s ran on hay-fueled horsepower. In New York alone, by the 1880s, there were over 150,000 horses pulling streetcars, wagons, and carriages. And each one of them could produce between 20 to 30 pounds of manure per day. Multiply that by the thousands, and you get a very aromatic situation. The streets didn't just smell like manure. They were manure. Mud, urine, manure, coal dust, bits of hay, garbage, and ash all blended together into a dark, sludgy stew affectionately called city mud. It clung to boots. It splashed into skirts. It soaked into the wood of front steps and window shutters. And when the sun hit it just right, well, let's just say city residents became experts at holding their breath between blocks. And yet, many believed this was better than what came before. Because before sewers, before municipal water treatment, before even reliable drains, cities were built on the bones of open cesspools and overflowing chamber pots. In the early 1800s, it wasn't unusual for waste to be thrown out windows. Garde-à-l'eau, some called as a warning. Others didn't bother. The result was a nasal assault. fecal rot in summer, mold in the spring, fish guts in alleys, insects buzzing around raw piles of pig offal, and a general bouquet that suggested civilization was winning the battle against nature, but only just. But then came science, or more accurately, the idea of science. Engineers, planners, reformers, people who thought smell was a solvable problem. In 1858, London learned the hard way that it wasn't. That summer, the heat rose and the Thames turned into a boiling river of human waste. The smell, dubbed the Great Stink, became so intense that members of Parliament fled the city. Some tried soaking their handkerchiefs in cologne. Others simply wept. But the crisis forced a solution: a new sewer system designed by Joseph Bazalgette. Massive underground tunnels redirected the filth downstream, and over time, the stench began to fade. Other cities followed. Sanitation became not just a necessity, but a movement. And with it came new scents, chemical ones. Streets began to be sprayed with disinfectant. Sidewalks were scrubbed with phenol or chlorinated lime. Public toilets, called sanitary conveniences in polite company, were outfitted with crude air fresheners that gave off sharp, camphor-like fumes. Public spaces took on the smell of hospitals and laboratories, sterile, biting, and metallic. Factories, meanwhile, pumped their own signature scents into the air. Tannery towns smelled like hot leather and urine. Textile cities like damp wool, grease, and dyed cotton. Chemical plants gave off whiffs of sulfur and bleach. Matchstick factories reeked of phosphorus, which lingered on workers' breath long after the doors shut. Each city developed its own olfactory fingerprint. In Pittsburgh, you'd smell steel and coke. Not the drink, but the coal byproduct, which coated every surface in gritty black soot. In Paris, it was perfume factories in the south, open-air urinals near the Seine, and cafe smoke drifting up from crowded boulevards. In Cincinnati, the porkopolis of the U.S., the air was thick with the smell of blood, brine, and lard. Slaughterhouses ran day and night, turning pigs into cash and leaving their scent clinging to every alley and apron. It was the aroma of productivity, of industrial power, of modernity sizzling at the edges. There was pride in these smells, strange as it sounds. A belief that if your city reeked of something powerful, sulfur, oil, ammonia, then you were doing something right. You were part of the future. And if your nose didn't like it, well, maybe your nose needed to catch up. Of course, not everyone agreed. Poets and artists lamented the ugly perfumes of the machine age. Novels of the time describe characters recoiling from the metallic fog or chemical winds of growing towns. Some moved to the countryside to breathe again. Others stayed and adapted, dabbing cologne under their noses, carrying perfumed handkerchiefs, or simply smoking cigarettes to cover the worst of it. Even cigarettes had their role. In many cities, tobacco smoke was considered a kind of social filter, a way to mask body odor, street stench, or public toilets that vented directly onto the sidewalk. If the 1800s were a game of olfactory survival, tobacco was one of the oldest and most effective players on the board. And all of this happened slowly, decade by decade, scent by scent, until one day, the air had changed completely. By the end of the 19th century, cities no longer smelled like the earth. They smelled like intention, like control, like we were trying to force the air itself to obey us. And in many ways, we succeeded. We replaced the sour rot of chamber pots with the stinging bite of disinfectant. We swapped pig guts for gasoline. We traded nature's musk for something we thought was cleaner, sharper, louder, but cleaner. Was it better? Maybe. Was it healthier? In time. But more than anything else, it was different. A new century was breathing down our necks, and it didn't smell like the one before it. Part 4. Food that smelled like factories. Step into a kitchen in the 1800s, and your nose is immediately confused. It might expect bread, or beef, maybe cinnamon or stew, but instead, it might get a slap of scorched molasses, the faint sting of coal smoke, and something oddly chemical, almost like a hardware store just baked a pie. That's because in the 19th century, food wasn't just a sensory experience. It was a gamble. It was also, like everything else, being industrialized. And that meant the dinner table often smelled like the factory floor. Let's start with sugar. Sugar was no longer rare in the 1800s. Thanks to colonial plantations and forced labor across the Caribbean, sugar became a cheap, everyday item in Europe and the United States. It flooded markets and pantries. People poured it into tea, baked it into cakes, and stirred it into their tonics. But industrial sugar wasn't always sweet. It was sticky, raw, and often scorched during refinement. The smell? Burnt caramel mixed with something vaguely metallic. That's because the machinery used to boil, scrape, and reboil sugar was often made of iron or copper. The sugar would absorb the flavor and scent of its environment. Sometimes this added depth. Sometimes it added rust. And sugar wasn't just in food. It was in medicines, soaps, cosmetics, and even embalming fluids. Burnt sugar was used to hide the odor of decay in mortuary preparations. So in some towns, you might smell baking bread and catch a whisper of funeral home. Next, there's flour. On the surface, flour should smell clean, dry, and neutral. But 19th century flour often didn't. It might have a musty scent from being stored in damp warehouses, or worse, a chemical tang from being adulterated. Because food regulation was still in its infancy, many merchants stretched their flour with chalk, plaster, or alum. Yes, the same alum used in pickling and tanning hides. This gave the flour a whiter color and a longer shelf life, but it also made it smell like wet plaster and taste like sandpaper. In poor neighborhoods, it wasn't unusual to bake bread that smelled faintly of wall dust and old laundry water. Even spices, once a mark of luxury, had lost their edge. By the mid-1800s, many ground spices were adulterated with brick dust, colored starches, or powdered nutshells. Cinnamon might smell like a carpenter's bench. Pepper might smell like damp cardboard. People still cooked with them, of course. But the fragrant spice cabinets of old had begun to smell like something else. Compromise. Preservation also brought its own bouquet. Without refrigeration, most meats and fish were salted, pickled, or smoked. The result was powerful. Cured hams that reeked of brine and firewood. Fish that smelled like vinegar and death warmed over. Grocery shops didn't so much display food as contain it, barely. Even fruits and vegetables came preloaded with odor. Apples were often waxed with a thin layer of animal fat to preserve them, giving them a slightly sweet, slightly sour smell with a tallowy back note. Cabbages might arrive wrapped in newspaper soaked in vinegar. Potatoes were often dusted with lime powder to prevent spoilage, which gave them a faintly caustic smell even before you boiled them. But perhaps the strangest smelling food innovation of the era was margarine. Invented in the late 1860s as a cheap butter substitute, margarine was initially made from beef tallow churned with milk. It had a waxy, dense texture and a smell that was hard to pin down, part dairy, part meat, part candle. Some cities banned it altogether. Others dyed it pink to distinguish it from butter. But margarine marched on, its weird aroma lingering in tenement kitchens and bakery shelves. And then came canned food. Napoleon's army had once sparked the need for long-life food, and by the 1800s, canning was in full swing. Tin cans lined shelves in grocers' shops, holding everything from peaches to mutton. But these cans weren't always reliable. Poorly sealed tins could ferment, swell, or leak. Opening one might unleash a metallic pop followed by a smell that was half syrup, half swamp. Canned milk was particularly famous for its scent. Evaporated milk, with its sticky texture and shelf-stable sweetness, smelled like sugar and rust at the same time. It was beloved in tea. It was also rumored to never expire, a trait that made it both miraculous and vaguely unsettling. Of course, the wealthier classes didn't always suffer these scents. They had fresh deliveries from countryside estates, clean linens, ice boxes, and servants to manage the less fragrant chores. But even their tables weren't immune to industrial touches. Their wines might be laced with lead-based sweeteners, their cheeses wrapped in cloth soaked in borax, their meats hung in cellars where rats and mold mingled invisibly. And in the dining room, amidst the roast beef and fruit tarts, candles sputtered, not always with beeswax, but with whale oil or tallow, releasing a subtle scent of burning fat with every flicker. Restaurants weren't much better. The rise of public dining in cities brought with it a mash of aromas. Picture it: narrow dining halls lit by gas lamps, tobacco smoke drifting between courses, the sharp scent of shellfish and cream sauce next to someone's boiled beef and pickled onions. Ventilation was minimal. Waiters wore cologne. Diners smoked between bites. And everywhere, the air was thick with oil, butter, sugar, and steam. If the home kitchen smelled like compromise, the restaurant smelled like collision. Even desserts weren't safe. Candy makers in the 1800s used brilliant green dyes made from copper arsenite to color their sweets. Candies often smelled slightly metallic, slightly burnt, and sometimes too sweet, as if the sugar were trying to cover something up. And then there were tonics. So many of them, dozens upon dozens, each one claiming to invigorate, rejuvenate, purify, or cure. Most were syrupy concoctions of sugar, alcohol, and herbs. Some smelled like molasses and mint, others like cough syrup, varnish, or turpentine. Some were laced with cocaine or opium. A tablespoon before dinner, a second after dessert. The scent of addiction, wrapped in caramel. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, food in the 1800s still carried deep meaning. A meal wasn't just sustenance. It was class. It was survival. It was aspiration. And so people endured the burnt, the strange, the sour, and the metallic. They ate foods they couldn't quite describe. They opened cans with hope and regret. They baked arsenic-laced pastries and passed them across embroidered tablecloths. And they told themselves, this is progress. After all, what was a little chemical tang in your tea if it meant convenience? What was a little coppery aftertaste if it meant you could buy soup in a can, candy in a tin, milk in a jar? And when the meal ended, the air lingered, in your clothes, in your hair, in your teeth. The smell of food that had learned to imitate itself. Part 5: Perfume, Poison, and the Cult of Scent. There was a time in the 1800s when scent wasn't just an accessory. It was an identity, a ritual, a declaration of class, of cleanliness, of control over the chaos of the world. To be perfumed was to be civilized, and to be perfumed strongly, that was simply good taste. At least that's what the advertisements promised. The 19th century gave birth to the modern perfume industry. Before then, fragrances were expensive and largely confined to elites, the royal court, the church, the aristocracy. But industrialization democratized scent. With synthetic chemistry, once rare materials could be replicated in laboratories, and fragrant oils could be extracted, distilled, and sold by the ounce. Suddenly, everyone could afford to smell like someone else. And they did, enthusiastically. The middle class embraced perfume with a zeal that bordered on religious. Department stores featured entire sections devoted to fragrances. Magazines printed fragrance guides and social scent etiquette. It wasn't enough to be clean. You had to smell like something. A rose, a lemon grove, a pine forest, a seaside breeze. Even if the rose was made from coal tar. Even if the lemon grove came from a factory drain pipe. Let's talk about what was actually inside those perfumes. Many of the base notes came from surprising sources. Musk, that was harvested from the glands of musk deer. Civet, from the glands of a nocturnal African mammal. Ambergris, a waxy substance formed in the intestines of sperm whales and found floating in the ocean. It smelled like a warm, sweet ocean breeze crossed with a candle factory, and it was worth more than gold. Then came the synthetics. By the late 1800s, chemists had figured out how to replicate complex aromas like coumarin, which smells like sweet hay or almonds, and vanillin, a synthetic form of vanilla. These new compounds were cheaper, more consistent, and longer lasting, but they carried a sharpness, a kind of artificial edge. Think vanilla with a chemical tail, or roses with a metallic whine. People didn't just wear perfume on their bodies. They infused it into their lives. Furniture was sprayed. Sheets were misted. Letters were sealed with scented wax. Ladies carried pomanders or vinaigrettes. Tiny lockets filled with perfumed sponges they could sniff in crowded streets or during particularly pungent dinner parties. The sickly sweet mix of body odor, powder, and perfume became a cultural texture. It was layered, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. And for all its beauty, it was also hiding something darker. Because many perfumes, especially cheaper ones, were made with dangerous solvents. Benzene, chloroform, formaldehyde, alcohols of questionable purity. These gave perfumes a longer shelf life and stronger projection, but they also came with side effects: headaches, nausea, even hallucinations. A dab behind the ear might set your heart racing, not out of romance, but because your nervous system was trying to evacuate. But the more intense the scent, the more effective it was seen. Victorians believed a strong perfume could ward off disease, that it could push back the miasmas, the bad air that was still blamed for cholera, typhus, and consumption. Doctors themselves often wore strong colognes to mask the smell of patients and to protect themselves from invisible contagion. There were even medicated perfumes, blends of lavender and eucalyptus mixed with camphor and alcohol. These were sold not as beauty products, but as health shields, dabbed on the temples, inhaled in railway cars, sprinkled on cribs and funeral wreaths. Then there were poison perfumes. Not intentionally, of course, but some fragrances were so potent, so chemically complex, that they crossed the line from wearable to weaponized. There are reports of women fainting in church pews from overscented neighbors, of shopkeepers banning certain perfumes because they triggered migraines, of perfume-induced hysteria in schools, hospitals, and dance halls. The stronger the perfume, the more status it implied, but also the more risk. Perfume became part of seduction, too, not just in the romantic sense, but in the psychological. A woman who smelled like heliotrope and violets was considered mysterious, refined, slightly aloof. A man who wore sandalwood and tobacco might be seen as worldly, rugged, slightly dangerous. These identities weren't earned. They were worn, spritzed, dabbed, powdered. There were even perfumes designed to smell like abstract ideas.
Bouquet de l'impératrice.
Essence of the night. Brilliantine for the melancholy. Scents were named like novels, with layered emotional scripts baked into each bottle. And of course, the poor couldn't always afford these illusions, but that didn't stop them from trying. Cheap perfumes were sold in street markets, often unlabeled, sometimes mixed on the spot. These concoctions reeked, not always in a bad way, but certainly in a bold one. They burned the nostrils, clung to clothes, and announced themselves in every room. You couldn't whisper in a cheap perfume. You could only shout. Some working-class homes used boiled orange peels, rosewater from backyard petals, or even vinegar steeped with herbs. They didn't want to smell like disease, or death, or sweat baked into their underclothes, so they covered it, however they could. But the scent of sweat still seeped in, especially in summer. Public transport was often unbearable. Omnibuses filled with warm bodies, gas fumes, coal smoke, and perfume all crammed into a single space. Imagine trying to read a newspaper while sandwiched between a cigar-smelling banker and a floral-clouded seamstress, all while the air outside was pumping in sulfur and manure. And yet, somehow, this cacophony of scent became normal, even comforting, because the world smelled like motion, like invention, like culture pressing forward, even if your nose had to be sacrificed along the way. There were critics, of course, writers who decried the chemical air of cities, health reformers who warned that perfume could hide rot, not remove it. But they were outnumbered. The perfume bottle was here to stay, even into death. Perfumed oils were applied to corpses before burial. Funeral wreaths were sprayed with scent. Mourning clothes were sometimes scented with lavender to hide the odor of embalming fluid. The final goodbye smelled like lilac and camphor, like beeswax and bergamot. In the end, the 1800s weren't just scented. They were defined by scent. Perfume wasn't just fragrance. It was faith that beauty could be bottled, that illness could be drowned, that class could be worn on your wrist and whispered through a handkerchief. And for all its flaws, its poisons, its headaches, its artificial notes, the age of scent was nothing if not human. Because sometimes, the only way to make sense of a world gone mad is to make it smell like roses. Part 6. The industrial nose learns to adapt. By the late 1800s, the human nose had become a battlefield. Everywhere it turned, something was burning, curing, tanning, or steeping in chemicals. Streets were smoky, homes perfumed, factories caustic. Even nature didn't smell quite natural anymore. The forests near mining towns reeked of sulfur. The rivers carried the scent of dye vats and runoff. Fields sprayed with early fertilizers carried the sharp tang of nitrates. And somehow, people got used to it. The nose, like the body, adapts, it filters, it normalizes. And for those living in the thick of 19th century industrialism, adaptation wasn't a choice. It was survival. This wasn't just about tolerance. It was cultural. People began to develop emotional relationships with smells that would make us gag today. Take coal smoke, for example. To us, it's pollution. Back then, it was security. The smell of coal meant warmth. It meant trains running on time. It meant the city was alive, moving, producing. Children would fall asleep to the rhythmic clank of coal carts and the comforting scent of burning carbon drifting in through cracked windows. Same with tar. Sticky, black and chemically pungent. Tar was used for waterproofing ships, paving streets, sealing roofs. It was the smell of labor, of men with rolled sleeves and stained gloves, of industry itself. It wasn't just tolerated, it was romanticized. Factories weren't avoided, they were tourist attractions. Visitors wrote about the sharp, thrilling scent of machinery at work, the hiss of steam, the hot iron scent of moving gears, the bitter bite of oil and polish. In many ways, industrial odor became a national perfume, every bit as patriotic as a flag or anthem. And yet, not all noses agreed. Immigrants arriving in cities like New York or Chicago were often overwhelmed by the air. Letters back home spoke of burnt air and metal breath, of food that smells like furnaces. Farmers who moved into tenement housing found themselves choking on a mix of boiling cabbage, kerosene, coal smoke, and laundry steam. For many, the city didn't just look different. It smelled like another planet. But slowly, the nose adjusted. People began identifying places by smell. You could walk blindfolded through a city and know when you passed a leather tannery, a brewery, a hospital. You could smell the bakery before. You saw its chimney. You could tell how rich someone was by the scent they carried, whether it was perfume, starch, or the soap they could afford. The smell of starch, in particular, became a kind of olfactory badge of honor. Crisp shirts, pressed petticoats, clean handkerchiefs, all required starching, often with mixtures that smelled faintly of wheat paste and alcohol. The result was subtle, a clean, dry, slightly sweet scent that whispered of respectability. By contrast, those who smelled of labor, glue, oil, sweat, or fish were often viewed through a social lens. Their odor wasn't just physical, it was moralized. To smell like hard work meant something, but it also marked your place in the hierarchy. And then there were the great events, world fairs, parades, industrial expositions. These weren't just visual spectacles, they were olfactory feasts. The 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris smelled like hot oil, steam, perfume, fried food, and exotic plants. The Chicago World's Fair in 1893 had electric lighting, enormous machinery, and entire pavilions devoted to agricultural goods. Imagine walking through halls of pickled vegetables, wax cheeses, jars of syrup, and the faint mechanical scent of newly forged tools, all under a ceiling of arc lights and flags. It wasn't just spectacle, it was synthesis. The modern world smelled like everything at once. Even transportation had its own signature scent. The horse-drawn omnibus reeked of hay, sweat, and manure. The early electric tram smelled like hot metal, dust, and the occasional whiff of burning insulation. Train cars combined leather seats, tobacco smoke, perfume, and boiled ham from the dining car. Steamships layered their decks with tar, brine, fuel oil, and the stiff starch of linen cabins. Travel meant taking the smells of one place and exchanging them for another, with your suitcase, your clothes, and your nose bearing the evidence. Children grew up breathing this in. For them, the scent of disinfectant in school hallways, camphor in medicine cabinets, and linseed oil on wood desks became childhood itself. Nostalgia was chemical. And nowhere was the evolution of the nose more obvious than in the workplace. Factory workers could identify malfunctioning machines by the shift in smell. A change in oil, a scent of overheating. Apothecaries learned to distinguish real lavender from adulterated blends by scent alone. Butchers could sniff out spoiled meat a day before it looked wrong. Candle makers memorized the difference between beeswax and tallow in a single breath. The nose had become a tool, part sensory, part survival. Yet as the century waned, a curious thing happened. People began pushing back. Writers started lamenting the loss of air. Poets wrote of yearning for the scent of pine trees, fields, flowers that hadn't been touched by soot or smoke. Urban planners spoke of green spaces not just for walking, but for breathing. The parks movement was born. Cities carved out areas of grass and trees where the scent of lilac could compete with the stench of tenements. Garden cemeteries were designed as much for smell as for sight, a place where roses could battle coal smoke, where death didn't have to smell like disinfectant. Some manufacturers even tried to bottle these new ideals. Country air colognes, forest mist soaps, candles that smelled like hay or honeysuckle. It was the birth of the artificial nature scent, not drawn from the real countryside, but from our imagination of it. But perhaps most telling of all, the rise of smell as evidence. By the end of the 1800s, scientists were studying smell in earnest. Chemists mapped scent molecules. Doctors used breath to diagnose disease. Criminologists began exploring scent tracing. Smell was no longer a primitive sense. It was data. And the modern nose, trained by decades of industrial odor, had learned to sort it all out. To parse the perfume from the poison, to identify danger, to recognize comfort, to survive. The human nose had entered the 19th century wide-eyed, assaulted, bewildered, but it left trained, hardened, alert, not just to what was safe, but to what was new. Because in the industrial age, the smell of progress wasn't always pleasant, but it was unmistakable. Part 7, The Legacy of an Invisible Scent. By the end of the 1800s, the air had changed. Not just because the factories kept churning or the chimneys kept coughing, they did, but because the human relationship to scent had begun to shift. What had once been accepted as the normal aroma of modern life, tar, tallow, bleach, starch, soot, was now being reconsidered. People had begun to long for a cleaner air, or at least a quieter one. The nose, once conditioned to tolerate arsenic-laced perfume and steaming streets that reeked of iron and cabbage, had started to rebel. In homes, chemical smells were still common, but they were being controlled. Disinfectants had evolved. Canned food no longer smelled like warm metal and vinegar, at least not always. Wallpaper